All right, thank you everyone for joining my session this afternoon. As Satwik mentioned, my name is Shanisa Cambrick, and I'm a Principal Product Manager with Microsoft, where I lead a team that's focused on developing innovative solutions to how we protect digital identities. In my talk this afternoon, I'll be pulling back the curtains on what it's really like to both protect and grow digital identities for one of the largest identity providers in the world, and do that with a zero trust mindset. Okay, all right, gotcha. All right, so disclaimer slide here is that the session may be recorded, just a reminder. All right, and I'll be breaking this down into 3 parts. So the first part, I'll talk about behind the scenes, setting the stage of why we need zero trust for consumers. What are some of the data points that we have at Microsoft that are driving this? And then I'll talk about the threat landscape and what it's like as a security defender working in this environment. And then we'll wrap with some key takeaways and some lessons learned. Right. So as a consumer business, you have a chart that's up and to the right showing 1 billion plus consumer accounts. That seems to be a good thing on the surface, right? That's the driver for your business. These are the metrics that your marketing team and sales team are using to determine are things going well. These are the same metrics that your senior leadership team are determining investments. These are the stuff of dreams, essentially, for your business. For me, this can also be the stuff of nightmares, because I know that on the surface, what you see isn't always what you get, right? As a security defender for a company that's stopping 2 million plus compromises a month, that's identifying 5 million plus attacker-driven sign-ins a month, I know that this is not always what it is. There's more to the scenes, there's more to the surface. There's more to what you see than what's on the surface of these data points, right? So attackers like to hide in these details. And a lot of times you hear the sayings of the devil's in the details. And again, attackers hide there too. So it's almost like a needle in a haystack where you need to look at all these data points and then determine what's really going on here, right? Growth isn't always a good thing, especially when it's not the type of accounts that you want in your environment. One of the things that I'd like to call out here is that when it comes to consumer accounts and protecting a business and thinking about this from a zero trust lens, you have 2 segments essentially. So you have compromise, but then you also have fraud and abuse scenarios. And with compromise, you have attack patterns that are pretty well known that you can use to define what's happening. With fraud and abuse, it's not quite that simple, especially in a consumer environment, because you don't necessarily have that baseline of behaviors that you can rely upon, right? And so for the rest of this conversation, I'll be focusing on the fraud and abuse scenarios here. Right. So with fraud and abuse, it's constantly changing. You have bots, so these non-human entities that are doing things like buying all of Taylor Swift's tickets and selling them for 4 times the price, right? You also have attackers that are targeting a segment of our population. You have attackers who are trying to steal payment information. And you also have scenarios such as cheat codes in games where people try to redeem those for prizes. So a lot of different scenarios at play here. And again, if you think about the consumer landscape, it's not static, right? You have different age groups, different demographics that you need to consider when it comes to how you protect these with a zero trust mindset. And with fraud and abuse, what we've learned is that it really is a tightrope here, right? So there's this balance between how do you put enough friction in place so that you're stopping attackers, but how do you not put too much that it's preventing your business from growing, that you're leading to a poor experience for your customers, right? And part of this is also perception versus reality, and how do you balance that as well? Right? Because it only takes 1 or 2 consumers to have a bad experience before everybody thinks that's the way it is. All right, so setting the stage a little bit, now we'll talk about the lay of the land and understanding our threat. So in talking about fraud and abuse, there's different dimensions, especially for a cloud service provider as large as Microsoft, right? So there are scenarios that include business impersonation, scenarios that include how attackers are trying to take advantage of our infrastructure, Things like crypto mining, for example. And I talked about the cheat codes. So there's this wide range of scenarios when it comes to fraud and abuse. And again, it's not very simple, like where you can look at a MITRE framework and say, this is what it always is, right? You have to look at all these different segments of the population and then determine how do you identify the intent of these attackers, right? Fraud is not so much, or when you try to stop fraud, it's not so much, again, those patterns, but what is the intent of the identity? And so it's almost like you're trying to predict what they're gonna do. And so if you've ever seen that movie Minority Report, where they're stopping or they're arresting individuals based on these data points of what they think that individual is gonna do, then fraud is very similar, right? Because you wanna get to them before they've actually done the activity. And throughout our conversation today, I'll say fraud and abuse. And one of the lessons learned for my team is that this is very different, right? We had to land on what is the real definition of fraud versus abuse? What do we mean here? And with fraud, what we're talking about is things that are related to payment information. So there's a financial impact. But we also have abuse scenarios that encompass fraud. And those abuse scenarios may be that you're violating terms of service. So there may not be necessarily a financial impact, but there's an impact to the environment or the ecosystem that that identity is within. So going back to the crypto mining scenario, for us, that could be abuse of our terms of service. Another scenario could be, storing pornography or illegal digital content within our services. So again, this is abuse of terms, but it doesn't necessarily cause a payment-related harm. Right. So when we talk about zero trust for consumers and we look at how do we actually build protection for these types of identities, we've looked at this from 5 different pillars. So ranging from left to right, we try to go in sequence, but you don't necessarily have that in every single case, right? But we want to try to build in as much of protective behavior with these different pillars as we can. So starting with prevention, and I mentioned about the movie Minority Report. Here it's gathering all these different signals and data points to understand or to try to interpret what this identity may be trying to do within your ecosystem, right? Are they there to cause harm? Are they there to do good things? For us, one of the ways that we do this, or a few of the ways that we do this, could be through machine learning, for example. So how do we dynamically determine the intent? We also use heuristics. So thinking about 1 + 1 = 2. Like you see this pattern every single time, you know that this is an attacker. So we stop them at the front door. We also look at containment. So again, thinking about zero trust, the idea is that you need to assume breach, right? So we know that we can't stop attackers 100% of the time. So what do we need to do once they get through our front doors? We need to quickly identify who those attackers are and then contain them through suspension mechanisms, through disabling, through removing of access, for example. From there, the next 3 kind of work together. So containment, detection, and investigation. It's kind of like a circular ecosystem. So detecting those identities, containing them, and then in some cases having human investigators who can look at different data points and say, this attacker slipped in, there was a slight telltale that let us know that this was an attacker. How do we feed that back into our prevention ecosystem, right? And then mitigation. So with the size of Microsoft, we have multiple different services, right? And we'll talk about this in some further slides, but these identities may be bad in one place or abusive in one place, committing fraud and harm in one service, but not necessarily across all of the services, right? So how do we let all these other services know that this identity now has a bad reputation? And so speaking of types of identities, we have our Azure AD, which is focused on enterprise customers. And then we have our core consumer identities. And so again, there's a range of different services that Microsoft provides with these consumer identities. And if you think about the consumer profile for Xbox, it may not be the same as Outlook and for Skype. So again, if you're determining or trying to assess intent and abusiveness of an identity, how does that go across this different ecosystems? For us, making sure that we're looking at both the sign-in, the sign-up behavior, and then the life cycle of an account. So as they reset their password, for example, how do we assess different indicators to let us know that this is going to be an abusive identity? And when we say abusive to Xbox, does that mean the same thing to Outlook? Right? So again, from a zero trust standpoint, this is where it gets really complex, especially with consumer identities. Right. So going back to our 5 pillars, the first one being a prevention type of mechanism. So again, we try to assess at sign up and sign in different indicators about these identities. So it could be the IP address that they're coming from. It could be the velocity of how quickly they're creating accounts. All of these different data points come together for us to say, we've seen something like this before. This seems like this could be an attack, or this could be a bad actor. So what do we do about that? For us, sometimes it's categorizing them into different levels of bad, right? And then sometimes it's outright blocking those identities. And one of the things that we look at is how do we challenge different accounts, right? So we know these bits and pieces of data about you. One of the things we want to make sure is that you are a real human. So you're not some bot, some script that's running to create accounts in our environment. And what we do is challenge those identities to say, prove that you're a real human. And this is one of the levers that we have in place. There's others that we like to use, but this is one to determine whether or not you're a bot. So going a little bit further, thinking about consumer trust and verifying identities. One of the challenges that we faced is what we've called sleeper accounts. So these identities that masquerade as a good user, but really intend to execute harm against our environment, right? And these are really hard to detect because, again, they come in looking like a good user. We call them sleeper accounts, and they may sit there for quite some time before they execute some type of harm, right? So it's really important that once we identify these, how do we feed that back into our 5 pillars, our ecosystem, to assess these in the future? I like to call this corporate catfishing because on the surface, they seem like this good user that we want in our environment, but then when you dig deeper, they're not really there for good purposes. All right, so drilling into our prevention a little bit more, we look at this from a few different lenses. First is our rules. And so if you think about zero trust, you have these policy engines that should be at the front end of how you assess an identity before you let them in, right? And so these rules are the same thing for us when it comes to consumers. I mentioned earlier, like the 1 + 1 = 2. So there's always this pattern. And once you identify that, then you say, these are not the identities that we want in our environment, or based on these other indicators, maybe we want them in our environment, but only in a certain portion of the environment. Next, say we decide to pass them through. Based on other risk indicators, we may decide to challenge them with other verification. So give us some payment details. Help us to verify you are who you say you are, right? And if you pass beyond that, then you're going to get caught in our ML models. So these are trained models that look at different anomalies, different behaviors, and say, based on patterns 1, 2, 3, XYZ, we think that this is a risky user. Right? And this is all based on our products. It could be based on different segments of the industry. It could be based on a myriad of factors, right? And as security defenders, we can't be in all the places all at once. And so it's really important that we rely on ML and ML models in order to determine where we have attackers in our ecosystem. Because going back to that very first slide, having 1 billion accounts within your environment, that's a lot, right? So going a little bit deeper into that first part of those rules, so having what we call heuristics. So with an identity, we usually have these data points that tell us this is normal behavior for this identity, or this is normal behavior for this type of identity. We've seen this before. And then when we start to see anomalies for a particular identity or particular segment of identities or IP addresses, then we can start to flag to say, we have some risk here, right? Previously, for this particular user, they log in from a certain device, from a certain IP address every time, and access this one application. Maybe 2 weeks later, they're logging in from a different device, right? And when you're thinking about an enterprise, this is kind of standard, and it makes sense to how you would want to challenge these. But when you think about consumers, where people may be sharing devices at home, for example, where they may be roaming to different IP addresses, this builds in a level of complexity, right, to apply zero trust. And so with that level of complexity, again, we rely on machine learning quite a bit, right? So the identities are going to go through this sign up, sign in, password reset or recovery process. We're going to look at all of these different data points, so trillions of data points that we have access to. It could also be our analysts who are sharing information. It could be third parties who are sharing information about this identity. And so taking that and feeding that into a model to say, based on all of these indicators, we believe this identity has a bad reputation, is here to commit harm, right? Or we believe this is a good identity and we're going to let them pass through. And in some cases, we don't have enough indicators that tell us with confidence that this identity is good or bad. And we may get it wrong. And so we learn from data points, feed that back into the model, so that the next time we see users like this, we know what to do. So with all that framing being said, we have these pre and post detection scenarios. And what's really important here is that as a defender team, making sure that everybody's aligned on which of these that we're going to focus more around, right? Because there is a cost factor, there's an experience factor, and then of course there's the security factor of all of these. So where do we focus most of our attention? Making sure that we have shared mission and goals when it comes to these things, and that we're all aligned on what does it mean to prevent or contain or detect, investigate, and mitigate these identities. All right, so let's go into the trenches as security defenders and some of our lessons learned in fighting fraud. All right, so this is a made-up scenario, but based on something real. Here we have an environment where a bad actor has gotten in, and what they've done is execute some crypto mining against someone else's environment, right? And they've caused millions of dollars of harm to this environment. They've abused Microsoft infrastructure as part of this, right? And for us, we can apply zero trust when it comes to the identities that are coming directly to us. But sometimes attackers are going through us, right? So this may mean a downstream customer is being impacted at this point. And we can't apply zero trust for you, right? We can give you some signals and indicators that say that there's this bad stuff that's happening, there's these risky identities within your environment, but we can't necessarily control all of the security settings that you choose to implement or choose not to implement, right? And so this makes it really hard for us as security defenders, knowing that, in the front door, we can stop certain attackers. We may not have enough visibility to stop those sleeper accounts that are not there to do Microsoft harm. We don't have those indicators that tell us that. But these accounts are then there to do another customer harm. And without having those data points come back from customers to tell us about these bad identities, how do we feed that back into our ecosystem? Right. And one of the things that I want to call out is that as zealous as we are about protecting Microsoft and protecting customers, sometimes we get it wrong. And in the consumer business and with the size of Microsoft, it's getting it wrong at scale, right? So I'm going to pause here, let you guys take a look, and tell me what you think. Right. So here, the interesting thing is that in some cases, we have these risk indicators for an identity that tells us that we believe they're there to perpetrate harm. We don't have enough to say outright block this identity, so we're going to challenge you, right? in this particular scenario, we've challenged in such a way that it's almost unsolvable, right? Essentially, it is unsolvable. I can't solve this, right? And so we're doing this at scale, right? And so sometimes this plays out in the media, for example, and it goes back to that perception versus reality, right? And I say a lot of times that perception actually equals reality, especially in the consumer space, right? Because our business, if they see things like this and they get a call from a customer that says, I couldn't sign up, to them, that's the ultimate no-no, right? Because we're stopping business at that point. And as a security team, you never want to be in the position where you have fingers pointed at you saying that you're stopping the business, right? So for us, it's learning from these experiences. How do we get smarter about attackers? How do we use different levers to challenge those that we don't know for sure? And again, feed that back into our ecosystem. This is real. This is real. I would say we had high confidence that it's a bad person, but you don't always know 100%, which is why security is so fun. Right. So with that being said, for us, it's leaning into metrics and growth. And what I mean by that is going back to one of the first slides where I talked about, you see this chart of growth, but you don't know necessarily what's underneath, right? You have to dig beneath those covers. And, for us, it's making sure that we have those conversations about cost versus consequence. How much money do you put towards tooling and services to stop an attacker versus the experience that you want your good customers to have? And this is something that, we struggle with pretty much on a daily basis. The other thing is aligning with your business on what is your let-through of fraud. And how this kind of plays out is because if you have say for example, you have a false positive rate of 1%. That sounds kind of low, right? But if you think about 1% of a billion, that's a million identities that are either bad or were good and we didn't let into our system, right? So again, we're having these challenges at scale. And then also lagging versus leading indicators. Again, going back to that primary chart showing consumer growth, that is, to me, a leading indicator. So our business is looking at that to make decisions. However, we know that with fraudsters, it may take a while for us to catch them, right? So we have to go back to that initial chart, rework those numbers, and say, this growth that we thought was good really isn't as good as we thought. So with all of this in mind, fighting fraud is definitely a team sport, right? There's a lot that goes into this. As security defenders, sometimes we make it seem easy on the surface, but we know beneath the covers there's a lot of that's going on. And so for us, some of the things that we look at in terms of a team sport is we have to come together to identify who is our adversary and what is their objective. Because this is going to drive the way that we challenge those identities and how we determine whether or not the reputation of that identity is good or bad, or what do we want to do about it later. Okay. From there, if we're looking at almost like an attack pattern, we need to assess what is the point of acquisition. So what are they targeting? What are they trying to get? How are they gaining presence within our environment? And for us, going back to sometimes they're attacking us, but sometimes they're going through us to attack others. Okay. And so this speaks to that a bit in that where is the attacker ultimately going, right? What are the platform and features that we have that they're trying to access? And it may not be ours, it may not be our particular cloud resources, but our customers' cloud resources. And this speaks to it a lot, is that who is the ultimate victim here? Sometimes it's our organization, sometimes it's our customers, sometimes it's the world in general. And what are they experiencing? And how do we interpret that information, feed that back into our systems to determine what to do? For example, like what is the impact? It could be revenue loss, it could be capacity issues that are impacting our customers, it could be harm to others. So if you think about some of those abusive scenarios. And at Microsoft, we have 20 plus teams that are involved across this space. So, there's my team, there's teams for each of our different services. There's a ton of folks that have to come together to protect and fight against fraud. Right? And so if you think about the theme of RSAC this year about being stronger together, we really do feel like we are stronger together because we do need to come together as a group in order to fight fraudsters. Right. So for me, the way I think about this is that ultimately this is a race against attackers. We know that we will never have 100% security. They will never stop. So it's all about who can keep the lead. How do you retool as you go round and round with these attackers? How do you diversify your toolkit? So, as the attacks evolve, how do you evolve your system? How do you feed that back into mechanisms to determine reputation and intent of these identities? What are the adjustable levers that we could potentially use? And so again, we have to think about that we have a wide range of identities from small children who are playing games on Xbox to maybe seniors who are making calls across the country on Skype to a mom and pop shop that are using Office 365. So we have to come up with a myriad of ways to make sure that we assess the intent of an attacker, but at the same time making sure that we don't push our customers away. A big one here is assessing risk tolerance. And this is both for us as an organization, but then also for our customers. So I serve Microsoft as a customer, and I have these business units, again, using Skype, for example. What is their risk tolerance for attacker identities within their environment? Because again, we will never have 100% of no attackers. So what's acceptable for us to catch and contain later versus stopping up front? Right? And with these different business units, that risk tolerance may not always be the same, which again makes it more of a challenge. Because if we're the team that's stopping at the front door, how do we give an experience that caters to all of these different services? Right. And then the last one is about holding the line. So once you've come up with a set of metrics and you understand how your business wants to operate, what's acceptable thresholds for fraud let through, or what's acceptable in terms of experience and making sure that we're challenging the right identities in the right way. Then holding that line and making sure that those 20 plus defender teams all are on the same page about what we do. All right, so key takeaways here in determining or assessing zero trust for an environment as you leave today. Within the next week or so, I would recommend that if you're a defender team and you're looking at fraud or consumer zero trust, that you're gonna agree on some baselines of what's good and what's bad in terms of those identities. Understanding those thresholds and the tolerance for fraud within your environment. Next, you'll want to talk about what's the trade-offs going to be when it comes to fraud prevention, detection, and containment, right? Because there could be some experience trade-offs, there's going to be some cost trade-offs, and if you optimize for customer experience, that means there could be some security trade-offs. So making sure your business is totally aligned with what that means. And then look at potential gaps within your consumer account lifecycle. So here in the sign-up, sign-in process, as an account goes through password resets and an ecosystem, are there areas where you need to put in additional levers and controls to assess for reputation, for risk of those identities? And then for us, it's also keeping in mind that we have this wide demographic that we need to account for. And then one of the things that's worked for us, or actually we're still in process of growing. Like security is always evolving, you have to evolve with it. And so for us, it's making sure that we have a metrics council, that's capable of looking at these different numbers that go out to our leadership, to our business, to our marketing teams, and saying, what's the story behind the story? So you're seeing this wild growth, but is it really what you want it to be, right? So involve us to make sure that we all have the same message and the same understanding of what this really means. And then finally, making sure that you have a strategy to diversify your fraud mechanisms. Because again, for us, we have this wide demographic, we have lots of different services. We know that attackers are constantly evolving. So if you just stick with the one thing in your tool belt, eventually they're gonna outpace you, right? And so be ready to adapt. All right, and so I went through that pretty quickly, but please do ask questions. I would love to comment on things. Yes?
So which zero trust model are you aligning this to? There's like two out there at least.
So I would say it's almost a play on zero trust in some ways, right? Like the biggest thing is making sure that we have a policy enforcement mechanism, that we contain identities so they don't have access to every single service, and that when they abuse those services, that we're kicking them out as quickly as possible. So it's almost a play on zero trust. Other questions?
When you talk about these protections, are you talking about protections for consumers or just from the Microsoft perspective? I mean, I know that I've gotten a lot of account takeovers, had to hunt them down myself.
So we do have a mix. So my team, again, like Microsoft is my customer for my particular team. And so we put in protections for Microsoft as an entity. But there's also protections that are available for consumers to use, like identity protection, for example, that's going to show you risky behaviors for an identity. You could set up policies there to protect your environment. Yeah. Yes? So the question was, with the 20-plus teams that are helping to support this, what are the disciplines that are involved? Okay.
Big team, small team.
Yeah. I would say it's spread out across a bunch of different small teams. For example, the size of my team is 6 people right now. We have investigative teams that are maybe like 10 to 15 people, and so forth. So it varies in size, but they're definitely not large teams. So when I say like this is a challenge and there's a lot that's going on behind the scenes, it's people working day in, day out trying to protect Microsoft and protect our customers. Yeah.
Quick question. What kind of metrics do you use to present to the business?
So one of the key metrics, of course, is account growth, which going back to that first slide of, we don't want them to only look at account growth because there's so much more to it. We also look at account usage. Then we look at our fraud let through. So after we've identified these identities that are abusive and we've suspended them through the system, what do those growth metrics then look like? So comparing those two charts to say, yes, we did have identities come in, we've suspended some. How do we get better about that suspension number?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
So you pointed out at one point that many of your customers, or you've got many users who are the customers of your customers.
Yes.
When addressing those abusive customers or second-level customers, how are you addressing that in your relationships with your direct customers? Hey, your users are screwing with us, or how does that play out within this process for you?
Yeah. So the question is, our customers who may have abusive identities entering their environment, and then their customers, how do we kind of play nicely together in an ecosystem?
Yeah.
Right? So I will say this is an area that's evolving for us. We quite frequently have touch points with other third parties that tell us they've seen some identities that have come from Microsoft that may be impacting them, and vice versa. So there's this data sharing activity that we have at hand. I can't really go into details about it, but I will say from an industry perspective that we are learning together, right? I've seen some metrics that say that fraud, the number is equal to about 5% of gross revenue for most companies, and it's growing. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you have any specific tools in place around initial trust or account creation, sort of
That's a great question. So the question is, do we have any tooling that's available to verify identities, if I understand correctly? And so I will plug that there are some other sessions that are happening this week on verifiable credentials. So there's new technology that says, how do we assess with confidence this identity is who it says it is? Yeah. And I'll say from a fraud perspective, these are also things that we're playing around with to assess these identities. Other questions? All right, so I want to thank you guys for attending my session today. I appreciate it. Thank you.